Well, good morning. We're going to continue in the book of Isaiah today. Our lesson book jumps on over to the 23rd chapter. Isaiah is a very large book, and I understand that as in most Bible books, God teaches us through repetition. That's the way to teach children. We're his children. And so there are some concepts and ideas, some proclamations, some statements, even the historical content is referred to in a repetitive manner. It's always, however, in our study and reading to look at every verse, but in the lesson, you'll get part of the lesson from reading your Sunday School Quarterly, and then part from your own study and your own reading, and then part from what I might share. Joanne called me last night and said that an old friend of hers had passed away, a gentleman who he and his family have lived across the street from her for many years and raised their families together on the same street and in the same neighborhood. Children grew up together. His name is Bobby Baker, and he's to be laid to rest. So pray for his family and pray for Joanne in the loss of a friend. Also got a text yesterday from Danny Ward, said that we'd been asked to pray last Sunday for Mackie Watts' mother, that she was in poor health and that she passed away this weekend as well. Pray for Mackie, our former pastor, and his family. Last Sunday we looked at, after that glorious temple vision that Isaiah had, I guess I intended a little bit more to look more into what we think of about angels. But I guess I don't have as much allure for angels since I've come to understand I believe in angels and I see them being used in the plan of God. And I know that they're still present in the world today. But the place of angels changed when Jesus came. Jesus became, as he was referred to in Isaiah chapter 7, he's Emmanuel. He's God with us. I guess if I ever had a night dream or a vision and an angelic being came to me and said, "I've got a message for you from God," I would say, well, God lives inside of me. Wonder why he didn't just tell me. Why would he send an angel? Angels became quite unnecessary after Jesus promised us that he would not only be with us, but he would be in us. There is no kind of external stimulus that we could have. Nothing that we could see, hear, or touch, or feel that is outside of who we are, that is closer and more powerful and more intimate than the living God, the Son of God living within us. Last Sunday also, and we learned from Isaiah chapter 1:1, when Isaiah started saying, this is when I prophesied, and he didn't give dates. He said it was during the reign of these kings. He named 4 kings. In chapter 6, he says, in the year that King Uzziah died. And so he's still relating. And a great deal of our lives can be benchmarked or milestone according to notable figures in our life. Famous people, people who are in leadership positions, people who have great responsibility in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the people whom they lead. And so, and often, as we looked at writings on ancient walls and in ancient texts, it never says it was in the year 2525. It never says that. It talks about who was reigning and who was the archbishop or who was the pope, or it mentions people because we remember people. And I always had a fascination in studying growing up in character studies and in biographies and autobiographies. Dates were often harder for me to remember. But we were introduced in the very first chapter, first verse, with King Ahaz. Now, I've talked to you about the parallel lines that the kingdom of Israel in the historical timetable of the Old Testament, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, they traveled parallel to each other for a very long time. And their history was marked by who was the king of Israel, who was the king of Judah, and marked more specifically, or particularly, I guess I should say, by those of us who study the Bible, because we become familiar with the prophets, or at least I do. I have my favorites among the prophets, and there are, when I study a particular prophet, I know that this is who he's talking to. This was to whom he was sent. And as you look at that parallel line, look at all those people. From what the Bible says and how this person is described, you would be led to believe that King Ahaz was probably the most wicked king that ever sat upon the throne of Israel. King Ahaz. I guess we could excuse him somewhat. We know now why Henry Fredericks is so mean. It's because he's been married to Barbara for 53 years. And maybe, do you know why King Ahaz might have been so mean and wicked? He was married to Queen Jezebel for a very long time. I don't think they were married 53 years, but they were a marriage made in heaven, it seems to me, or someplace else. I think that you could just look there in the Bible, and if you saw them in person, you see King Ahaz and his, she was painted up. See, that's from an old Kenny Rogers song, isn't it? Yeah. She painted up her face and rolled and curled her tinted hair. Ruby, are you contemplating? Yeah, I'm going out. I'm not going to stay here with you. I don't blame that girl in that song.
Yeah, Mel Tillis wrote it.
Really did. And it's really based on an idea of an old Johnny Cash song. You know, Johnny Cash had an old song called Don't Take Your Guns to Town. I remember Mama used to play that record. It had a picture of Johnny Cash all dressed in black, and he had his guitar on his lap, and he had his arms over like that. It was just a black album cover. It was when he was very young, of course. I don't remember the name of the album, but Don't Take Your Guns to Town. I played it on our little record player.
I can tell you the name of the album. It was the first album he did for Columbia. It's called The Fabulous Johnny Cash. Mom had it.
Say it again.
The Fabulous Johnny Cash.
The Fabulous Johnny Cash. Okay, you've got to have a lot of gall to name a record after you like that, but it was probably worthy of the work. I loved Don't Take Your Guns to Town. And if Mel Tillis wrote that song, he may have not told you this. It might not even be true. But I believe when he was writing in that song, the line that says, don't take your love to town, I think that was at least in the back of his mind. She was painted up, Jezebel, and she was a sight. And she was a tremendous evangelist for the cause of the worship of Bain. She must have been a great beauty. She seems to have been a very harsh personality. Everything that I hear her say seems to be very harsh and severe. But maybe that's just my imagination. She had no kind words to say for Elijah. She threatened to kill him before the sun went down. And though Elijah had stood in the presence of Ahaz and talked face to face to him as king, when Jezebel issued that threat, Elijah ran away and hid. I probably would have too. There was a vineyard that Ahaz wanted. So Jezebel just had the man he wouldn't sell the vineyard to Ahaz. It had been in his family all his whole family's life. And so Jezebel just had him killed. It says Ahaz was laying on his bed with his face to the wall, pouting. Have you ever heard the great sermon, Payday Someday by Robert G. Lee?
Yeah.
That's what that sermon is about. And Ahaz was going to get his payday one day, and so was Jezebel. But last Sunday we looked at Isaiah chapter 7, and God spoke to Isaiah the prophet and said, I want you to go to King Isaiah and tell him this. Go to King Ahaz, Go to King Ahaz, tell him this. Just ask me for a sign. Ask me for a miracle. Ask me for something wondrous. Just anything, just ask me. Now, today's lesson is that talking about God and how he relates to political or military or religious leaders. How is it that God could allow, the title of the lesson from our quarterly today is that God reigns. How is it that a God who reigns, how is it, and this is the way the questions are like this are often asked about God, how is it that a God who knows everything and has all power could permit someone like Ahaz to sit upon the throne of Judah? It seems contradictory, doesn't it? If you get to a place where you feel, why or how is it that God could relate to that person over there, you must think that I must think somehow that I'm worthy of God's attentions. I can see why God loves me. I'm so lovable. I just can't see how God could love that person. Why he would even speak to that person. Why there are people that you might even refrain from speaking to. There are people you might avoid. There are people that you might turn your back on. Or people that you feel like those are not my kind of people. I don't associate with people like that. But you'll find, I wonder where Jesus got his bad habit from.
Well, when Jesus was here, the people at the bottom rung, for lack of a better terminology, were the ones that he went to.
No doubt Jesus got his bad habits from God, because we see that even though, you see, Ahaz was, do you think that God placed Ahaz on the throne? Or at the very least, he did not prevent Ahaz from coming to the throne of Judah because he thought that there might be great potential there, or that things might work out, and that there was a great chance for Ahaz to be a great leader? No, he knew that Ahaz was going to be a rounder from the very minute he was born, before he was born. God's not surprised by things. He doesn't figure things out. He doesn't sit up on his throne and say one day, well, I kind of thought Ahaz might turn out to be a better king than that. No. When the Bible describes, either in Kings or Chronicles, or in the books of the prophets, it describes Ahaz as having led Israel farther into the darkness than any other king that ever sat upon the throne. Now remember, do you know whose throne he's sitting upon? It's the throne of David.
It's David's throne.
It's the throne that God set up and said, there's always going to be a king that is related to David sitting on this throne. And God sent Isaiah, and he said, go to that. Hey, do you think God is blind? Is he perverse? Is God twisted in some way that... You see, God doesn't seem to be intent on removing Ahaz from the throne, or taking the crown away from him, or to bringing judgment upon him. He actually comes to him, and the Syrians and the kingdom of Israel are ganging up, and they're about to attack the kingdom of Judah. And Isaiah comes in, and they're worried. They're scared to death. They don't know what to do. Ultimately, what they're going to do, what King Ahaz is going to do, is he's going to establish an alliance with the Assyrians. The very worst thing he could have possibly done. Instead of taking God at his word and accepting God's help, he instead allied the kingdom of Judah with the Assyrian Empire.
He went with what he thought instead of checking it out with God.
Exactly. Now, you might think that God is intent, or one of his great purposes is to get the world rid of Vladimir Putin as the premier of Russia. I don't think so. Is it because Putin is a good person, or he's honest, or he's strong, or he's a great leader? In many regards, he obviously is a successful leader, but he may be none of those things. As we look at the Premier or the Prime Minister of Canada, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the President of the United States, the Shah of Iran. They don't have those anymore, do they? They got rid of that one. The Ayatollahs of the world. And here God sent Isaiah. I think that we think that there are political figures in our country who are such good people that surely God is on their side. Or there are such bad people that obviously God is going to refrain from helping them. But let me tell you, God sent Isaiah to Ahaz and said, just tell him to ask for anything he wants. I'll give it to him. He would have, and he says, you think of your enemies? He says, they won't even exist anymore. It'll be done. They'll be gone. And Ahaz refused to take it. When you cast your vote in November, are you going to cast your vote only for good people who tell the truth, who always do what they say they're going to do, who believe in God and are great Christian people and are spiritual giants? Is that who you're going to vote for? You know, I don't vote for people at all. I'm going to find out. My number one thing, there's really only one political issue that I care very much about at all, and that's the life of unborn children. Whether they are local politicians, state, federal politicians, I want to vote for somebody, I don't care how ugly they are. I don't care which party they're in. I don't care what they do or don't do, but if they are going to take a stand against abortion, then I'll not vote for them, but I'll vote for that. I have never, and I will never, cast a vote for any politician who supports Planned Parenthood or who supports abortion on demand or believe that abortion is a constitutional right. You can look at some of the greatest wickedness that is recorded in the Bible, and you will find it is that in the greatest times of darkness, what the people in leadership positions felt that they needed to do was to reach out and end the life of innocent children. And they did it by the thousands. A part of Baal worship was to appeal to the good graces of Baal by offering little babies into his arms. When politicians, they want to talk about health care and about foreign policy or about the economy, as long as there are 5,000 abortions in our nation every day, none of that should make any difference to you at all. I'm telling you, not as a prophet of God, but as a preacher of the Word of God, I believe with all of the millions of pregnancies that are ended and have been ended since 1973, that is a great blight upon our country and our nation. Now, you may have been involved in an abortion. You may have had an abortion yourself. You may have someone you love very much that has had an abortion. I know that people who have had this tragedy in their life sometimes feel it's hypocritical to in any way prohibit others from also ending the lives of innocent babies. This is something that I've condoned. How can I condemn it in the lives of others and the choices of others? I have to allow them to have a choice. That is very poor logic. If ever you have made a mistake in your life or you have a tragedy in your life, it is not your responsibility to make sure that other people have the same opportunity to have the same tragedy in their lives just because you made that choice in yours. Now, here in chapter 23 of Isaiah, verse 1, it says, the burden of Tyre. Howl, you ships of Tarshish, for it is laid waste. So there is no house, no entering in. From the land of Chittim, it is revealed to them. Now, when the people of Tyre and Sidon heard this prophecy, they said, well, that doesn't sound right. Everything looks pretty good to me. There's my house right over there. There's where you go in the door. And Isaiah was saying, I'm telling you something that it's not now. It's coming. Be still, ye inhabitants of the isle, thou whom the merchants of Zidon that pass over the sea have replenished. And by great waters the seed of Sihor, the harvest of the river, is her revenue. And she is a mart or a market of nations. Be thou ashamed, O Zidon, for the sea hath spoken, even the strength of the sea, saying, I travail not, nor bring forth children, neither do I nourish up young men, nor bring up virgins. As at the report concerning Egypt, so shall they be sorely pained at the report of Tyre. He says, all right, let me tell you about Egypt. When they hear about what's happened to Tyre, he said, it's going to make them afraid. Pass ye over to Tarshish, howl, ye inhabitants of the isle. When he's talking about howling, he's talking about a lamentation, a grief. He's talking about weeping that is surpassed just the shedding of tears, but literally howl of the soul. Is this your joyous city whose antiquity is of ancient days? Her own feet shall carry her afar off to sojourn. Who hath taken this counsel against Tyre, the crowning city, whose merchants are princes and whose traffickers are the honorable of the earth? He said, you know, you wouldn't think about what a wonderful, great, powerful, prosperous nation Tyre is. The Lord of hosts has purposed it to stain the pride of all glory and to bring into contempt all the honorable of the earth. He is saying, God has permitted you. You've had this success and this prosperity, but he says it's about to come to an end because it is God's will and it's God's design. Pass through thy land as a river, O daughter of Tarshish, there is no more strength. No power, no great military, no great prosperity or wealth, no strength. He stretched out his hand over the sea. He shook the kingdoms. The Lord has given a commandment against the merchant city to destroy the strongholds thereof. He said, thou shalt no more rejoice, O thou oppressed virgin, daughter of Sidon. Arise, pass over to Chittim. There also shalt thou have no rest. Zidon and Chittim had an alliance. They were neighboring nations that they traded with each other. They held each other up. They benefited each other. He says, no, Chittim's not going to be able to help you. Behold, the land of the Chaldeans, this people was not, till the Assyrians founded it. For them that dwell in the wilderness, they set up the towers thereof. They raised the palaces thereof. And he brought it to ruin. Howl, you ships of Tarshish, for your strength is laid waste. And it shall come to pass in that day that Tyre shall be forgotten 70 years, according to the days of one king. After the end of 70 years shall Tyre sing as a harlot. Take a harp. To sing as a harlot, that's kind of like a circus barker. The women of the night, that's the way they attracted their trade. They would go out into the streets. Or probably, I've seen this on the balconies in New Orleans. The ladies of the evening, the ladies dressed in red, singing out, hollering out, calling out, advertising their wares. And it came to pass after the end of 70 years that the Lord will visit Tyre, and she'll turn to her hire, and shall commit fornication with all the kingdoms of the world upon the face of the earth. And her merchandise and her hire shall be holiness to the Lord. It shall be treasured. It shall not be treasured nor laid up, for her merchandise shall be for them that dwell before the Lord, to eat sufficiently and for durable clothing. He says they're going to get to the place where the only thing that's going to matter to them is, I just wish I had some clothes to wear and something to eat. And so these things, we have a tendency to believe that God is just the God of Christians, or that Jesus is just the Lord of his own followers. This is something that was developed by the Jewish people from the Old Testament. They believed that they had the market cornered on God. They believed that God was their God, not in the sense that they were his subjects or they were his children, but it's like someone who possessed a statue, or someone who had some kind of trinket or some kind of man-made, handmade idol, and it belonged to him. I remember when Jacob took his wives and his family and they fled in the night. Rachel stole her father's gods, hid them in her saddle packs. Laban, he woke up in the morning and all of his children and grandchildren and their household, they were all gone. And he went chasing after them. You know why it says he went chasing after them? Because they had taken his gods. Yeah. What if you had a God that you possessed, that you owned, that was yours? And this is the God of the prosperity gospel. The God who does what I tell him to do. The God whose only interest in all eternity is to make sure that I'm healthy and happy and wealthy and wise. What a terrible God that is. We see here that God is the God of the whole earth. He's the God of the universe. He's the God of these pagan people. And they have a responsibility. They have not had, the prophets of God has also prophesied to them. We might look around and we might feel that certain world circumstances seem to be completely in a tumult, that everything is coming unraveled. I see so much of that on social media, that so many people think, Lord Jesus, please return, because everything in the world is flying off the rails. That's just not the case at all. Many people, when they've been suffering from the judgment of God, have felt that everything is going to seed. It's never pleasant, it's never happy, it's never enjoyable to suffer from the judgment of God. God told Job that those who sow the wind will what?
Reap a whirlwind.
They will reap the whirlwind. We've sown a lot of things, and sometimes we're just getting our harvest. Sometimes what we planted is coming up. And that's really what Isaiah is saying right here. It says, you have been sowing. God has blessed you with prosperity and with growth. He said there weren't any Assyrians until somebody just went out in the middle of the desert and just began to build towers and palaces. He said they didn't even exist. They weren't even a people. And here he's saying to them, all right, it's payday. It's a time for an accounting. And he says, he literally told Tyre, 70 years. 70 years. If you have a tendency to look at some Democratic candidate or some Republican candidate or some elected official or some leader in our country and say, well, obviously, that is not someone that God takes note of at all. I assure you, and this is not something that might be popularly received, the people who are in leadership today, if you think that they're there because of the votes of the people, or because the votes of the populace, or because the votes of electors, you're wrong. People are who they are and where they are because God reigns over history. The psalmist said the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. And God guides his steps. We can think of some of the worst leaders in human history. Do you know that when we think of the teaching in the Bible of the Messiah, do you know that there have been a number of Messiahs? There's not just the Messiah. The word anointed is used, and people in the Old Testament particularly were often described as the chosen one, the anointed one. Do you know that there was a king who of the Persians, and he was chosen by God. He was pagan. He didn't even believe in the God of Israel. His name was Cyrus, and he was called the Messiah. He was the chosen one. God selected him. Do you know what he did? He looked out at how many years that Israel had been in bondage as they had been carried away to Babylon. And Cyrus passed a decree, not only for the Jews, but for all the foreign people. He did something that was inexplicable. He said everybody could go back to their homeland. I know today when people say, why don't you just go back where you came from? Well, that can be derogatory, but for the people of that day, most of them had a very strong sense of where they came from, and it was their heritage, it was their family, had been their life, and there was still property there, and there might even still be people there to whom they were related. And they went back by the thousands. They went back by the thousands because Cyrus freed them. Well, Cyrus wasn't even what we would think of as a saved person. He wasn't even righteous. He wasn't even a believer in God. God uses people of every kind imaginable. And what you have to do is, you can't look at Cyrus's religion, or how many wives he had, or what his personal or moral attributes were. You have to look and say, what did he do? In some way, some shape, form, or fashion, God told him to let the people of Israel go back to their homeland. And he did. You have to look at what he's doing. What did he do? God told him to do something. And in spite of all of his moral or ethical or religious failings or anything we might be able to say against a pagan unbeliever, God told him what to do, and he did what God told him to do. Cyrus was one of the chosen, a messianic figure. Well, folks, we're going to continue on. Thank you for coming today and being part of our lesson in our class, either remotely or in person. And I don't think the Fredericks are mean all the time. And I do congratulate them. And I'm sorry they didn't get to go to Captain D's, but they did get to go out and celebrate. All right, pray for those who are hurting today and rejoice with those who are rejoicing. It's almost always, a little bit of both. God bless you all. Have a good rest of the day. Join us for our 11 o'clock service if you can.